Well, hello everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to see so many people interested in bilingualism and developmental language disorders or special educational needs. What I'm going to talk about briefly is to raise, with the aim of raising awareness with regard to the distinction between language and communication. Language and communication are usually intimately linked. So we talk about children with language and communication disorders, but I would like to point out that perhaps they're not exactly the same. So the question is, if you are bilingual, does that mean that both your language and your communication skills are going to be equally affected by your bilingualism? Are they going to be positively enhanced, or are they going to be affected in a negative way? We know from other research that bilinguals are usually better communicators than monolinguals, even if they make mistakes in their speech, like myself, who I'm not a native speaker of English, and Francesca, who was just before me. So even if we are not perfect in terms of the use of language, in some ways it seems that communication-wise, the research shows that bilinguals seem to have an advantage over monolinguals. Now, in order to understand the distinction between communication and language, one important dissociation that we need to understand is that communication is a very complex phenomenon, and it involves some of components which are linguistic and some components which are not linguistic. So obviously oral communication involves speech, sign language involves signs, so there is an expression in both cases. Language, which would give you the grammar and the vocabulary. It's also important, however, to communicate, to have what we call pragmatics, which is the feel of what is appropriate and what is inappropriate in a certain context. Like, you can't say to somebody, good to see you, if you meet them for the first time. There is also the aspect of social cognition, which is extremely important, and this is perhaps the fundamental of communication. Social cognition is the ability to take into account other people's intentions and beliefs, their wishes and their knowledge, which might be different to yours. Finally, to be a good communicator, you need to have what we call executive control or cognitive control, which is a set of skills in our brain which controls, for example, our attention, our decision making, but also the actions that follow our decisions. So the question is, when you speak two languages, what happens to all these other components, and ultimately what happens to communication? So what I'm going to show you is some data from a study, but I'm going to simplify, and it's not so important to look at the data as such as the difference between the language and the communication tasks that we use to dissociate the two abilities. We had 120 children. Their language is Greek. The second language is Greek for the bilinguals. For the monolinguals, it's Greek as a first language. And the other language that the bilingual spoke was a variety of languages. Could be Albanian, Russian, German. The children are, the average age was 10 years old. And the range was basically throughout the primary school, from grade 1 to grade 6. We gave them some language tasks and some communication tasks. For language, we tested them on vocabulary, and we tested them on grammar as well. Vocabulary was a task that was a standardized task. It's actually adapted and standardized in Greek. It came from English, Renfrew task, the expressive vocabulary. You look at the picture and you have to name the picture. There were 50 pictures to name, and what you can see on the graph there is that the blue bar, which is the monolingual children, performed better than everybody else, which is what we would expect. The bilingual children were a bit lower, the typically developing. TD stands for typically developing, and SLI stands for specific language impairment. Now, it is evident here that there is a negative effect of bilingualism because monolingual children in both the typical group, the typically developing group, and the children with language impairment actually performed lower than the monolingual. So the monolinguals were better than the bilinguals. When we look at the grammar test that had to do with repeating sentences verbatim, which involves working memory as well, not just knowledge of language, what we found was very interesting because the bilingual children, the purple bar, the last one as you see on the graph, they performed better. The bilingual children with SLI performed better than the monolingual children with SLI. So what we have here is some sort of advantage which was unexpected because bilingual children are supposed to have lower grammatical knowledge than the monolingual children. But remember that in a sentence repetition task, children are also need to exercise their memory, their working memory. And it seems that these children have, because they are bilingual, apparently it seems that they have better working memory. Let me now turn to communication skills. And I'll give you two examples only, because my time is almost up, I suppose. So, communication skills, one of the best and most effective communication skills is when you ask somebody, when you test somebody on communication, you could ask them to tell you a story. Storytelling involves all sorts of different abilities, cognitive, pragmatic, communicative, and crucially linguistic as well. This is a story with cartoons from a standardized task called the Edmonton Normed Narrative Instrument. The title doesn't matter, you can find it, it's free, you can find it online. The children were asked to tell a story on the basis of the pictures that they were looking at. Now, we won't have time to go through this. Perhaps later I can show you the difference between the narrative of a monolingual child with language impairment as opposed to the narrative of a bilingual child with language impairment. Those of you who are very quick readers, you might be able to see that the bilingual child is actually using more complex structures than the monolingual child. When we try to score and evaluate how complete the stories that the bilinguals and the monolingual children were, what we found is that there was a positive effect of bilingualism because both bilingual children typically developing and bilingual children with language impairment outperformed the monolingual peers. Okay, so they're better storytellers, at least. Okay, that means better communicators. And the last part of communication test that I want to show you does not actually, one part involves language and the other doesn't. I don't know if you're familiar with these tests, but these are the typical tests that we use for social cognition. They're also known as theory of mind tests. One is called Sally-Ann, and the other is the Smarties. So I'll show you the typical Sally-Ann task. This is Sally, this is Anne. Sally has a basket, Anne has a box. Sally has a marble. She puts the marble into her basket. And then she goes out for a walk. Anne takes the marble out of the basket and puts it into the box. Now Sally comes back. You ask, she wants to play with her marble. So you ask the child, where will Sally look for her marble? What's the right answer?
She's going to look at the basket.
She's going to look at the basket. Right. So children with communication impairment respond, she will look for the marble in the box. Okay? And this is some deficit in theory of mind. The Smarties task is the other typical task that we use to test theory of mind. You show a child a tube of Smarties. You ask them, what do you think is in here? They say, Smarties. You open the tube, you show there is a little pencil. And then you ask the child, if I showed this, you close the tube again, putting the pencil inside. If I showed this to your friend, what do you think she would think was inside the tube? Well, again, the answer is a pencil, if the child has a communication impairment, or Smarties, if the child doesn't. So that's the typical test that we use for children with autism. And this is an ability that develops after the age of 4 in typically developing children. We found no effect of bilingualism here in both the monolingual, so on both Salian and Smarties. There is no negative or positive effect. Remember, these tasks involve language. The last task I'm going to show you, somebody has to put the presentation. So this is social cognition without language. Okay. Right, so what the child was presented with the video, and what they had to say was whether the story ended in a natural way or not. So they had to say yes if it was natural, no if it was unnatural. Now the correct answer here is no. And so here are the yes results, so the incorrect results. What we see is that the monolingual children with language impairment had the poorest performance. But what we find is that bilingual children with language impairment performed better than monolingual children with language impairment. And this is a very clear and significant result. So to go back to our question, it is clear that when you're looking at vocabulary, when you're looking at, strictly speaking, grammar, bilingualism cannot compensate for language impairment. So if you're bilingual, you're not going to speak the language better just because you are bilingual. In fact, the chances are that your vocabulary is going to be lower. However, bilingualism will actually make you a better communicator because it will improve your ability to make coherent stories, complete stories. It will also improve your non-verbal communication skills, as we saw in social cognition. So, in all, multilingualism seems to be able to compensate for poor communication skills by improving social cognition independently of the effects it has on language skills. Thank you very much.